All right. Go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 3, 13 through 17, if you have not already. We'll read this text, and then we will provide you 5 minutes to consider a question about the text. It should be very familiar to you, because we have here the account of Jesus' baptism. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. And John tried to prevent him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and are you coming to me? But Jesus answered and said to him, Permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he allowed him. When he had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Okay, so with that, I think, familiar account in mind, I will want us to ask this question about it. How do I, and that is, I want you to ask yourself this, how do I keep God's will at the center of my life? What can you learn from Jesus in this text that will help you keep God's will at the center of your life? You have 5 minutes. Okay. That 5 minutes is either really slow because you can't figure anything out as you're thinking through it, or how could it go by that fast as I'm scrambling for all this information? You know what the difference is between those two things? 2 years in school. Right? 2 years, that's right, 2 years in school. It changes very much as you go through. All right, so we're looking at Matthew chapter 3, 13 through 17. The question is, how do I keep God's will at the center of my life? What'd you come up with? John? Say it again. Make every effort. Okay, what in particular did you see that in the text it says, make every effort? From verse 15? Okay, from verse 13 then, yeah. He had to start in Galilee, and he was coming a distance just for this purpose. So that's good from that. Okay. Yes?
Basically keep your ego out of the center of it.
Ah.
John tried to avoid it because he's like, I'm not worthy. But Jesus said, no, we have to do this because even though he didn't have to, so often we're stopped by either, I'm not good enough, which is John's, or, well, I don't, it doesn't need to be done.
Yeah, okay, good. That's a really good point. I've got that in a number of ways in my notes, because the idea of ego and who I am being a question of whether or not I should do what God wants me to do should never enter the picture, should it? It's kind of like, should you think, should it change that you're a celebrity of trying to get off of a ticket? I'm not mentioning any celebrities from Dallas, that have been in the news recently. Nothing at all. But should that matter? No. You should do what you need to do. You do the right thing no matter what. Okay, so that's a good point. What else? Heather?
Verse 14. Don't let anybody discourage your own obedience.
Good. Don't let anyone else discourage your own obedience. That's exactly right. Amy? Okay, that's right. Don't listen to your own will. That's kind of at this, to get God's will at the center, you've got to get yours out of the way. Okay? This almost is a process of doing that. Because it's one thing to say, now think about the problem we've got here. What do you have to do to get your will out of the way of God's will? Well, you have to exert your will, but the will could be the problem. So you need a process to understand, what do I have to consider, work myself through, practice on, and focus on if I'm going to do exactly that. Because you're exactly right that you've got to get your will out of the way. But that means you've got to, at the very beginning, figure out what does it take to do that, right? To stop exercising your will. Because you have to exercise your will to do things, but it's a huge shift in mindset at the same time. Okay. Dean?
Exercising our own will is like, I want to do this. But really, that's not what we got here. What we got here is, I think God wouldn't want this. Okay, you think about it today if it happens. I think God would want this. I think God would want that, regardless of what the Bible says.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's really good. So you're looking at, from John's point of view, as he's thinking, I don't think God would want this. So you're kind of playing off that. I like that, because there are a lot of people that we have a lot of kind of pop culture Christians going on, Facebook theology, right? That is, we know all. It's like Facebook. I'm waiting for the meme Bible to show up on our shelves. Honestly, aren't y'all? Sooner or later, someone's going to have a meme Bible. It's just all memes to take you from Genesis to Revelation. Okay. Why? Because culturally, we want an easy way to feel our way to doing what God's will is. And there are a number of ways in which that plays out. The obvious thing is just you have decisions to make, and you go with what you feel based upon how you were brought up, but then in your head, it's always justified as being God's will. That's part of the problem, is we confuse, going back to Abe's point, we confuse our want-tos with God's will. And we kind of tie them together, which makes us feel better about it. Okay? The same thing actually happens when you are trying to understand the Bible, as I call it, the problem of exegesis by instinct, is when you're trying to feel your way through the exegesis and you don't actually have something solid, thorough, and objective that you're following, but it ends up being a kind of, just kind of general by feel, and that tends to play into confirmation bias as a problem. And you can see that actually online quite a bit. Yes, Sandra.
For us to fulfill all righteousness, we're told to always seek that righteousness.
Okay, so you're going to tie in what's going to come up just a little bit later in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, about you got to seek righteousness in order to do righteousness. And it was clear from this that righteousness was already on Jesus' mind. And I totally agree. Matter of fact, righteousness is a theme of Matthew, of his explanation of Jesus. And there's a reason for that, because it's about both through Jesus doing the right thing that God wants him to do, that he makes it possible to make us right with God, which is kind of a combination of those ideas. So yes, absolutely. Stephanie.
Honoring God in ordinary acts of faithfulness.
Say it again.
Honoring God in ordinary acts.
Oh, okay. Good. I have that down in a different way. Is that honoring God in ordinary acts of faithfulness? In other words, is there anything just some kind of spectacular about being baptized? No. Okay, right. It doesn't. What is that a judgment of? We're judging by a worldly standard what God has said to do that is an amazing thing. So what does that say? We're trying to judge in a carnal way what God says, instead of taking what God says and listening to him to judge the world about what really is the right thing to do. So that's exactly right. And the fact you said is ordinary things. Sometimes the most ordinary things are the most important things if it's what God says to do, right? They're the most important things to do. No, I think that's a great observation. Yeah, Ron?
First of all, acknowledging that God does have a will.
Okay, good. Good.
If I can't get there, it's kind of hard for me to.
Okay, very well. That God has a will. So, I mean, that is expressed in the fact that Jesus essentially says, here's what I'm doing, and then that is affirmed at the end by God himself. If you don't understand why that matters, we are in a cultural shift, where the idea of that God has a will has been, number one, the idea of God himself is slowly being eroded, and matter of fact, it's really picking up steam in society. But even among those who would acknowledge God's existence, they're pretty weak when it comes to his will. Okay, and all the polling suggests that in general. Okay, so that's not a small thing that Ron just said. It's actually a very important thing. Sutton? Yeah. No, exactly right. Okay, that it's not. I'm gonna take this down from what you're saying, and if I go off track from what you said, let me know. But I'm going to start with a very important thing you just said, which is, but I'm going to reword it for general. If we're only concentrating on just getting the wrong out of our lives, instead of doing the right in our lives, we're not accomplishing what God wants us to do. You've got to be about adding the good things in. Jesus did not have to be baptized. What his point is, he didn't have to be baptized for remission of sins. It was for a different reason, which we'll get to in a minute. But it was a different reason. That was a good reason. Even though it's not the same reason that Acts 2:38 says for you. It wasn't the same. Remember, John baptized for the remission of sins, Mark chapter 1 and verse 4. But that's why he was looking at Jesus saying, what are you doing here? He was there for a different reason, which was a positive reason, that he was still there to do what God wanted him to do. Baptism itself, even at this point, okay, they already knew what baptism was. This wasn't a new idea when John came. They already had all these mikvahs, right, baptistries. They were all over the place. Why? Because they baptized proselytes. That was the step of you're starting a new life. Okay? That was that understanding of newness. They also did this for priests. Okay? It was you're starting something new. Now take that understanding of and put it to Jesus when he says fulfill all righteousness. Is what is this point in Jesus' life? This is Jesus accepting the ministry. He's not been involved in ministry yet. He's sinless, but he hasn't been involved in ministry yet. This is Jesus accepting the ministry. Why? To fulfill all righteousness. All of God's will for the Messiah cannot be accomplished unless I take up this step positively. And that's what he does. And that's why I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I saw Roger?
Permitted for now.
Mm-hmm.
The roles are temporary. Whatever role we have is also temporary. The only thing that will last is God's will and God's glory.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we bear that in mind. Christ certainly understood it.
Well, what?
That will help keep us at the center.
Yeah, you're talking about perspective too. Is it about God's will? You have to have perspective about God's will. Is that John did not understand at that moment why. What does Jesus do? He does not go into a long thing. He's actually saying, just hang loose, follow through on what I ask, and gain some. The perspective comes. Now, what I say about perspective, to tie it in with what you said, Roger, do you think John understood something after the baptism happened and he's coming out of the water? Now, technically, does it say John saw? It doesn't here, but does it in John? Yeah. So why are you want to do this? And he's essentially saying, just trust me. Now, think about this for just a little bit. I don't have much time to get through this, but if John acknowledged the superiority of Jesus' character in that statement, which he did, correct? If he acknowledged the superiority of Jesus' statement, then shouldn't he be willing to acknowledge the superiority of Jesus' judgment? Which is what Jesus was essentially giving here. He was explaining to him that basically, trust me on this. There is a reason. He gave him the reason. And you see John, even though there's not an full-on explanation, it was enough for Jesus, because he did trust the character, to accept the reason that he had a reason. That it was, and why? Because it's different than the reason everybody else was being baptized. And it was a good reason. Okay. Now, did he appreciate what was going to happen right afterwards? No. That's where the perspective really changed. Okay, but to actually build on that, this is a tangential point. And I'm going to tie in what Stephanie said to this. Doing the ordinary daily things of Christianity, of applying, reading and studying God's Word and reading it and praying, working on yourself, working on self-control and doing these things, just really basic things, the payoff is later, and you're not going to see it in the moment. John got a fairly quick payoff on that, but he went ahead with doing and did it and accepted what Jesus said and followed through on it, and then got something wonderful that he got to witness as a result of simply doing ordinary things of listening and wanting the right thing. And that is what Christianity will offer you. The benefit, the framework of obedience and seeing the world and the peace you get and the hope, totally different from what goes on in the world. Those are the benefits. Stephanie.
And so to go with that, our culture wants the good thing now, reassurance
Yes.
now. That, okay, I have the good thing, now I'm obedient. But that's not the order that
Okay, no, that's exactly right. The order is the listen now and do the hard things and get the great things later on. Another way to think about this, to build on your point, then I'm going to move on. But when you see the life of Jesus as a whole, even though we're here in this beginning point, wasn't the entire life of Jesus about accepting the hard? Tell me one time Jesus took the easy route. He turns toward Jerusalem, not away from Jerusalem. He moves into the temple, not away from the temple. He waits to let his friend die before going to raise him from the dead. He does everything that is a tougher way because it has a greater benefit. And that culminates in being willing to accept the cross. The toughest thing you could ever ask someone to do. And he accepted it. Well, what was the payoff? Resurrection, glory, sitting at the right hand of God in heaven. The hard has tremendous benefits, but it requires what Stephanie is pointing out, of prioritizing the difficult so you can get to the great, rather than settling for the mediocre and sometimes problems and the things that are fleeting for something that is a problem in the end. So that's perspective building. Okay, last thing.
I didn't catch it at the 5-minute window, but looking at it now, that reference in 15 appears to be from Psalm 40, verses 7 and 8.
It, we just went over that in its context in Hebrews 10 today in class. So yes, because that's a messianic psalm in Psalm 40 that is saying the difference between what does God want? Does he want particularly sacrifice and offering? It says, I do not desire. Is God willing to forgive you? Yes. You know what he'd rather have you do? Not sin in the first place. That's kind of the key element there. And Jesus, with the sacrifice and offering, it's in that thing of being the sacrifice. That what the preference was for God's will to be done. And that's why I think that the proper thing, again, at the end of Matthew, is not my will, but thy will be done, as the core essence of the way Jesus lived. Okay, let's walk through it. This is good stuff. You're going to see some repetition here because of that. When you look at this, here we're going to start where we started. I'm going to word it this way, though, John. Be proactive in seeking God's will. Be someone who seeks it out to do it. Okay? You see that in Ezra chapter 7, verse 10. You see that, and we refer to in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. But seek it out. He's not just, okay, I'm sitting back, I will do whatever I need to do as I sit back and don't do much of anything. Okay, that's a very different idea from launching forward and saying, I'm actively seeking out, I need to do this. That's the will in motion set aside from the very beginning to see what does God want for me to do. Okay, so it's a proactive thing. So what do you have to do to shift yourself into proactive mode? This is the popular term for this is being intentional. Okay? Being intentional about seeking God's will, not passive and just simply accepting of God's will. In any situation you're in life, do you sit back and wait for someone to tell you and to introduce God's perspective? Or is that what you're seeking out? What is God's will on this for me to do? Which way is it? Are we actively seeking out, or are we waiting for someone to have to tell us that it's wrong? Okay. Two totally different perspectives. Okay? Also, verse 14, John tried to prevent him. We had a great conversation about this, and I forgot who brought it up. Do not allow others. Is that you? Do not allow others, with this in mind, no matter how close they are or how good they are, dissuade you from doing God's will. The person who you disagree with on just about everything, that their whole very physical being repels you, it's not going to be a big temptation for you to cause you to not do God's will. That person's not your problem, right? It's like you would have a number of people right now, just do a quick poll. How many people here think it would be a wonderful, fun thing to have a skunk as a pet? Hands up. All right, that's an easy one, right? That's a bad idea. Now, there's some people that do it, right? We need to make sure they are seeing the appropriate doctors. It's not the kind of thing you really should do. We know better than that, okay? What is hard for us, though, is the closer the people are, where there's emotion involved, there are ties there. Remember that John and Jesus are cousins. They know one another. John knows Jesus' life very well. Well, don't you think that is the other way around too? And Jesus is not going to let John, now think about how it was. It was very flattering, wasn't it? Think about just how this worded. If someone came up to you and said, you need to baptize me. That's a very flattering thing. You're better than I am, right? Isn't that the point? So the nature of the temptation, of the pressure here, was not, persecution. It was flattery. Now, it was real, but I'm just talking about where the temptation would be, because it was based in reality. Guess what? Was John right? He was right in the sense of that Jesus did not need to be baptized for the remission of sins. Wasn't he right about that? Yeah. Was he right that Jesus was superior to him? Yes. None of that mattered because of what Jesus was there to do. God's will. And therefore, it didn't matter these other relationships. You have to make sure, this is why it's so important, marriage, children, that you're both on the same page about God's will is first, or else the other person, even caring and wanting, and because they care, can try to push you the wrong direction. Because they care. Not because they don't like you, but because they care, can end up pulling you the wrong direction if we're not equally committed to God's will is the direction we go. So it really is important. Last part here in verse 14. Do not compare yourself to others when considering your own need to do God's will. Someone had this too, I believe. Don't compare yourself to others. Does it really matter what anybody else needs to do? Is that going to change what you need to do? Well, what about him? You remember the times you get this of the apostles? The what about him situations? Sometimes they're going to be, they're wanting to be great, right? That was, right, James and John, the mother. Okay, wait a minute here. And then you have Jesus, after his resurrection, telling the disciples that, telling Peter that he's basically going to be martyred. And he turns and points to John, essentially, and says, hey, but what about him? He says, what's that to you? What does it matter? And the reason why, and I want to put this in a modern framework for us, do we kind of live in a comparison culture a little bit? Right? Social media is just horrible about that, because several years ago I said is that you got kind of the people on Facebook. You got your number one, the lurkers who don't post anything. Right? I'm kind of almost getting there, but I don't belong in the other two categories, and that's good. Why? Because one is you only post every good possible thing, and your life looks like it belongs in a magazine. Because you only post all these you do all these things. Wow, wow. And so we compare our vacations on Facebook, right? Right? And then you got the people that the only thing you hear about them, the only thing they post is every bad thing that ever happens. Right? So the sympathy vote. All of it is still about a comparison rather than just simply dealing with me. Sorry. Dealing with me. Okay. So don't compare. He's making that comparison instead of just saying, why would the fact that someone, that say you're better, okay, are there people and say, well, they don't ever do anything. Does that mean you should do less in the church? Because other people are? Does that change the nature of your obligations or what you're capable of? Because somebody out there doesn't do that much? No. So why are we comparing? The main comparison should be, am I doing God's will to the best of my ability? That should be what we're considering. Not whether anybody else is. If anything, it's let me help them after I've worked on me. But not try to make up a list of where we fall. You know, are y'all familiar with in a race where the guy, I can't even remember it just off the top of my head, but where the person thought that they had crossed the finish line early and they stopped running? They'd won, except they hadn't. Sometimes we do that when we're comparing, is that we actually give up our win. Okay. We talked about this in verse 15. Permit it to be so now. Now, I don't know, Roger, if this is part of where you were, but I want to word it this way. Be patient with people who do not understand God's will as well as you do. This is not a harsh reprimand, is it? It's very gentle. Very gentle. Why? Because he understands John. He takes it for granted that John's motives, he says, they're the good motives. His heart's in the right place. Be patient with people. Not everyone. Matter of fact, I'd probably guess that none of us are at the exact same place. Yes, sir.
Doing God's will should be an encouragement to other Christians.
Yes.
And by doing that, it should be encouragement to elders, deacons.
Absolutely. And that goes back to kind of Hud's point about the example. Is it when we are out there? Now, we need to be direct about our help, though. We can't just kind of, I think sometimes we overestimate how much people are watching us. But sometimes we can also underestimate that people may just see that, and that may be the motivation they need. Okay? Yes, absolutely. So, but we're all at different places. All right? Different levels of understanding. Does that mean that if you're not at the level of understanding as someone else, that you're not a Christian and you're not faithful or you're not saved? Nope. It means you're just in a different place. The goal is to work toward God's will no matter what or where you are, and that includes on how you treat others in that process. Be patient. For thus it is fitting for us. This is the point I was making on the fitting for us. Trust in God's will to persuade others rather than your own efforts or reasoning. He basically, by saying this, it is fitting for us to fulfill our righteousness. It is fitting. This is the appropriate step. He was not pushy about it, but he is basically implying, trust me, I'm following God's will. Now, he didn't have a Bible to point to for what he was doing, except for maybe Psalm 40. Okay? It's fitting. Now, think about fitting for us. Now, is he using a royal we here? This is fitting means the appropriate thing, essentially. This is necessary if I'm going to do everything that I'm supposed to do. And notice that that is actually not a personal kind of thing. It's a God's will thing. So he says to fulfill all righteousness. I described more of this a minute ago, but you need to commit yourself to all righteousness rather than just accepting partial righteousness. Jesus was he was sinless up to this point. But there was this whole big next step of the ministry before him. Jesus was not here to be passively perfect. His perfection required being actively fulfilling God's will, not just passively going through life anonymously. That's not good. Quickly now. Number 7, never consider any aspect of God's will beneath you. We covered that. Ordinary things. Number 8, seek the pleasure of heaven through doing God's will rather than the pleasure of earth through your own. That was Amy's point. Very good. This is my beloved son. Okay. I do want to emphasize this before we go. Always consider the relationship between doing God's will and being God's child. Now, this is specific for him, but it is true for us, isn't it? Are we doing God's will thinking of him as our Father? And make pleasing God by doing his will the most important thing to you, your big motivation. I want to please my Father. All right. I had more I was going to go into on the narrative, but we don't have time. There are essentially those points that I just gave you. But I appreciate I really can't say enough how much I appreciate the input and the comments. What you're getting out of this and showing me you see. That's very encouraging to me, and I hope it's helpful to you. Thank you very much.